She arrived at a dead man's ranch, not a man in a coffin, but a man whose soul had been buried for years. His name was Olin Merrick, and his ranch, Broken Arrow, was as silent as a graveyard. The fences leaned, the porch moaned, the very air felt heavy with things left unsaid. Then a wagon crept up the path, and a woman stepped down. Bessie Malvin. She had worn boots and eyes that held more secrets than the Nevada desert. She wasn't looking for a job, not really. She was looking for a place to disappear. Olin stood on the porch, his grief worn like a dusty coat. "You're the one who answered the notice," he said, his voice like gravel. "If the job's still open," she replied, her gaze steady. She wasn't afraid of his silence, she was used to it. He just nodded. "Kitchen's round back. Side room's yours. Things are quiet here." "Quiet suits me fine," she said, and as she passed him, her skirt brushed his coat. It was a flicker of contact in a world of empty space. Olin Merrick didn't know it yet, but the silence in his house was about to be broken, not by noise, but by a woman who knew that the quietest people often have the most to hide. And he was about to find out she was one of them. Bessie didn't waste a minute. Before the sun was up, the kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. She didn't make a fuss. She just worked. Olin watched her from the shadows. He'd see her kneading dough, her hands strong and sure. He'd see her humming a tune so soft it was barely there. He never said a word, just watched. He was a man who'd forgotten what life looked like, and he was studying her like a map to a place he couldn't remember. But Bessie didn't mind his stare. She knew about men who watched. She'd worked for one in Carson City, a man with soft hands and a cruel smile. He hired her to cook, but he wanted more. He wanted her silence, her submission. When he reached for her wrist, she didn't just look away. She pulled back. The next morning, her things were on the street. "Women like you don't last," he'd sneered. She didn't answer. She just left. She was good at leaving. So Olin's silence didn't scare her. It was a language she understood. It was the same quiet that had filled the room when her mother was dying during the war. The silence of survival. But this silence felt different. It felt watchful. Even the dog, Copper, an old hound with ribs like fence posts, kept his distance at first. Then one morning, as Bessie hummed that same forgotten tune, the dog got up, walked over, and laid his head on her feet. Olin saw it from the porch. His eyes narrowed. Something had just shifted. The house had chosen a side, and he wasn't sure if it was his anymore. He thought he'd hired a housekeeper, but he was starting to suspect he'd let something else entirely into his home, a force he couldn't control, and he was right to be worried. Then the storm came. It rolled in without warning, a black wall of fury that ripped across the prairie. Bessie was hanging laundry, and the wind tore the line from her hands. Olin's white shirts took flight like ghosts escaping the ranch. She didn't hesitate. She ran into the maelstrom, skirts whipping, hands snatching at the runaway clothes. She slipped in the mud and went down hard. Before she could move, a hand grabbed hers. It was Olin. Rain soaked his beard. His coat was dripping, but his grip was solid as rock. "Didn't think you'd be out in this mess," he said, his voice a low rumble against the thunder. Soaked and breathless, she just grinned. "Didn't want your clothes ending up in California." And for the first time in 3 long years, a smile touched Olin Merrick's lips. It was a small thing, barely there, but it was enough. They walked back to the house together, a silent truce called against the storm. That night, she heard a noise, a soft creak from the hallway. Olin was standing there in the shadows, just watching her shape bred by the firelight. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. For the first time, his shoulders weren't braced for a blow. The hollow silence of the house was gone. In its place was something new. something that felt an awful lot like a beginning. But beginnings can be deceiving. Olin thought he was seeing the real Bessie Malvin. He was wrong. The quiet days stacked up, one on top of the other. Bessie didn't just cook and clean, she started breathing life back into the forgotten corners of the house. She polished windows until they shone. She fixed a drawer that had been stuck for 5 years. She worked like a woman trying to build a fortress, one small repair at a time. Olin noticed everything. He'd stand in the kitchen for longer stretches, just watching her hands, her calm, her quiet fire. He was a man who had locked his heart in a drawer and thrown away the key. Now this woman was patiently sanding the wood, checking the lock. One morning, a package appeared by the back door. Brown paper and twine. Inside was a pair of new leather shoes, soft but strong, made for walking, not for working. She held them for a long time, the unspoken question hanging in the air. That night at supper, she broke the silence. Those shoes weren't an accident, were they? Olin didn't quite meet her eyes. Saw 'em in town. Figured they looked like they knew how to carry a woman who don't sit still. They're finer than any pair I've worked in, she said, her voice steady. Good, Olin replied. They weren't meant for work. A line had been crossed. This wasn't about a job anymore, this was something else. She wore the shoes the next day, a silent acceptance. But as she moved through the house, she felt his eyes on her, and there was a new intensity to his gaze. He wasn't just watching her work anymore. He was trying to read her story, and he was getting dangerously close. That night, long after she'd gone to her room, Olin sat by the dying fire. He walked to a heavy oak chest in the corner, a piece of furniture he hadn't touched in years. He opened a drawer. The scent of old lavender filled the room. Inside was a bundle of memories from his late wife, a ribbon, a button, and a folded piece of paper. He read the last note she ever wrote him. Olin, don't let the house die with me. Let it breathe again. He read it 3 times, then he closed the drawer. He was letting the house breathe again, but he was terrified of what might rush in. The next evening, another gift appeared by her plate. A silver brooch shaped like a desert rose. No card, no words, just a silent offering. Bessie picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate petals. It was a beautiful thing. It was also a test. A question asked without words. She pinned it to her dress. A week later, he handed her a child's drawing. 2 stick figures in front of a lopsided house. My wife drew it, he said, his voice tight. Right after she told me we were expecting, after she died. I couldn't stand to see it. He had just handed her the key to his locked-away heart. Bessie traced the drawing with her thumb. It's still growing, Olin, she said softly. You just planted it differently. Something in the house finally let go. A long, held breath. Olin thought he was finally seeing the real Bessie. He thought the gifts and shared secrets were building a bridge between them. But what he didn't know was that Bessie recognized the brooch. She had seen one just like it before. Years ago. In the possession of a man she never wanted to see again. The man from Carson City. And she knew, with a cold dread creeping into her heart, that her past was about to ride up the path to Broken Arrow Ranch. Trouble arrived in a sealed envelope. Olin came back from town one morning, his face a thundercloud. He slapped a letter on the kitchen table. The paper seemed to pulse with menace in the morning light. Bessie read it. Then she read it again. It was from a man named Franklin Wooten, Olin's brother-in-law, a man he hadn't heard from since his wife's funeral. Franklin was claiming he had rights to the land. He had a letter, he said, from Olin's late wife, leaving him her share. He was coming to collect. Never saw a letter, Olin said, his jaw tight as a fist. He's a vulture, circling. Bessie didn't flinch. She ran her finger over the signature on the envelope. She looked at the postmark. Then she looked at Olin, her eyes clear and sharp. "The handwriting's off," she said. "The seal is wrong, and this was mailed 2 weeks after she died." Olin stared at her. "How would you know that?" "I worked for a lawyer once," she said, her voice flat. "Filed half his records while he drank his lunch." It was a half-truth. The lawyer was the man from Carson City, the man with the soft hands and the desert rose brooch, Franklin Wooten's business partner. Suddenly it all clicked into place. This wasn't a random claim. This was a targeted attack. Franklin wasn't just after the land. He was after her. He had found her. Olin rode to Red Gulch the next day and showed the letter to Charlie Merritt, the town lawyer. Charlie took one look and snorted. "This is a sloppy forgery. The ink's not even dry, metaphorically speaking. Whoever did this is an amateur." "It was Bessie who spotted it," Olin said. Charlie looked out the window toward the ranch. "She's sharp. You better hold on to that one, Olin." Olin rode home with a new fear in his heart. It wasn't just about the land anymore. He had let someone into his life, someone who could see things he couldn't. Someone who was now in danger because of him. A week later, Franklin Wooten showed up. He wasn't alone. 2 hard-faced men rode behind him, their hands resting too close to their guns. Olin was on the porch waiting. Bessie stood beside him, her posture as straight and unbending as an iron rod. "Still clinging to your claim, Olin?" Franklin said with a greasy smile, swinging down from his horse. "Grief makes folks sloppy." He looked Bessie up and down, his eyes lingering. Didn't realize the help spoke for the land now. Before Olin could move, Bessie took a step forward. Her voice was ice. "Funny," she said. "Neither did the land. Not until someone started tending it." Franklin's smile vanished. He recognized her. Well, Bessie Malvin, I should have known you'd end up in a place like this." He turned to Olin. "You know who you've let into your house? This woman is a thief. She stole from her last employer, a good friend of mine." Olin's jaw flexed, but his voice was a low growl. "She ain't the help. She's the reason this place has breath again." That's when another rider appeared, Charlie Merritt, the lawyer, holding a sheaf of papers. "Franklin," Charlie said, his voice booming across the yard, "the court's seen your forgery. The ruling is clear. You have no claim, no rights, no standing." He nodded at the 2 gunmen. "And unless you're looking for a charge of fraud and intimidation, I suggest you be on your way." Franklin stared, his face turning a blotchy red. He looked from the lawyer to Olin and finally to Bessie. His eyes promised revenge. He swung back into his saddle and rode off without another word, his men trailing behind him like stray dogs. Olin let out a breath he'd been holding for years. He turned to Bessie, his eyes full of a dawning understanding. "You saved this place." She didn't smile. She just took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, Olin," she said. "We did." The dust settled. The immediate threat was gone. But Bessie knew this wasn't over. Franklin Wooten wasn't a man who forgave or forgot, and now he knew exactly where to find her. The ranch wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a target. The victory over Franklin changed things. The town started talking, but the whispers were different now. They weren't just about the grieving recluse and his mysterious housekeeper. They were about the woman who faced down a swindler and saved Broken Arrow Ranch. One Sunday morning, Olin came into the kitchen wearing a clean shirt. There was a nervous energy about him. "There's a church picnic today," he said, not quite looking at her. "I thought, maybe we could go." Bessie knew what he was asking. It wasn't an invitation to a picnic. It was a declaration. He was stepping out of the shadows and he wanted her by his side. "You haven't been to town for something like that in years," she said. "Maybe that's the reason I should." She nodded once. "All right then, let's go." She wore a simple blue dress and the silver desert rose brooch pinned at her collar. It was a message. She wasn't hiding anymore. They rode into Red Gulch side by side in the wagon, a silent, united front. And people noticed. "Is that Olin Merrick?" someone muttered. Thought he'd gone full ghost. That's the woman, another whispered. The one who ran off Franklin Wooten. Mrs. Tilda Farnham, the matriarch of the pie table, gave Bessie a sharp look, then a kind smile. You must be the one we've been hearing about. The house up at Broken Arrow looks lived in lately. I keep it warm, Bessie said. He keeps it standing. Good trade, Tilda nodded. But not everyone was so welcoming. Cleo Tisdale, a woman whose piety was as sharp as her tongue, whispered loudly to her friend, living together with no ring. It's a shameful thing. Before Bessie could react, a small hand tugged on her dress. It was the preacher's daughter, Mary Beth, holding a fistful of wildflowers. Mama says these are for pretty people, the little girl said shyly. I think you're the prettiest here. Bessie knelt, her heart aching. Thank you, sweet girl, she whispered. Olin saw it all, the whispers, the glares, the small act of kindness. He stood up, and a hush fell over the picnic lawn. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone listen. This is Bessie Malvin, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. She keeps my house, and she keeps me from going cold. If anyone has a problem with that, they have a problem with me. Silence. Then, Amos Griggs, a gruff old rancher, grunted. Man's got a right to keep from going cold. He passed Olin a plate of chicken. The tension broke. Plates were passed. Room was made at the tables. They had been judged, and they had been accepted. That night, back at the ranch, Bessie placed the wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill. The house didn't just feel lived in anymore. It felt like a home. But as she looked out at the dark road leading away from the ranch, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She knew Franklin Wooten was out there somewhere, nursing his wounded pride. And she knew that men like him didn't just walk away. They waited. They planned. And then they came back, not with forged letters, but with fire and steel. The public victory had just made them a bigger target. Life settled into a new rhythm, a quiet melody of shared purpose. Bessie planted a garden behind the house, coaxing desert roses from the hard, unforgiving soil. Olin watched her one morning, her hands deep in the earth, and that evening, a bench made of fresh juniper was waiting for her at the edge of the garden. A place to rest, a place to sit together. He started leaving her small gifts, a book of poetry, a ribbon for her hair. She started reading to him in the evenings by the fire. He'd grumble about metaphors, and she'd smile, explaining that some things are meant to be felt more than understood. They were building a life, word by word, gesture by gesture. The walls Olin had built around his heart were crumbling. The silence in the house was now filled with the rustle of turning pages and the low murmur of their voices. It was a fragile peace, and they both knew it. Then came the day Olan left for Barlow's post to pick up supplies. Be back by sundown, he said. Sundown came and went. The sky turned from orange to purple to a star-dusted black. Bessie waited. She lit a lantern and placed it in the window. She paced the floor, the old dog Copper whining at her feet. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow looked like a threat. She saw him just before midnight, a staggering figure stumbling down the trail, silhouetted against the moon. He was alone, no wagon, no horse. She ran to meet him, her heart pounding in her throat. His shirt was torn, and his side was dark with blood. He was clutching his ribs, his face pale with pain. What happened? She cried, helping him lean on her. Horse spooked, he gasped. Wagon flipped, down by the canyon. You walked all this way? He nodded, his teeth gritted. Didn't think. There was time to send for help. He looked at her, his eyes desperate. Figured you might not be here when I got back. The words hit her harder than a physical blow. After everything, he still thought she would run. She got him inside, cleaned and bandaged the wound. It was a deep gash. His ribs were likely broken. He was lucky to be alive. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. Why would I leave? Olin stared at the fire, his face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with his injuries. Because good things usually do. She sat beside him and took his hand. It was cold and trembling. I'm not going anywhere, Olin, she said, her voice fierce. Not unless you ask me to. He didn't answer, but his fingers curled around hers, a desperate, drowning man's grip. As she tended to him through the long night, a chilling thought took root in her mind. A spooked horse? A wagon flipping near the canyon? It was too convenient. She remembered the look in Franklin Wooten's eyes, the promise of revenge. This was no accident. This was a message, and the message was clear. I can take everything from you, one piece at a time, starting with the man you love. Olin healed, but the recovery was slow. The wound on his side was deep, but the wound to his spirit was deeper. He'd wake up from feverish nightmares, reaching for her in the dark. Bessie stayed by his side, a constant, steady presence. She read to him. She fed him broth. She talked to him for hours about the garden, about the stars, about anything but the canyon. She never mentioned her suspicions about Franklin. Olin was too weak, too broken. But she saw the way he'd stare out the window, his jaw set, his eyes searching the horizon. He knew it too. They were prisoners on their own land. One evening, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Bessie was sitting on the juniper bench by her garden. The desert roses were in full bloom, a defiant splash of color against the dust. Olin came out onto the porch. He was walking without a limp, his shoulders back. He walked over to the bench and sat beside her. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the day die. I used to think this land would bury me, he said finally, his voice rough. Bessie looked at him, her expression soft. Maybe it still will, she said, but not before it gives you something back. He nodded slowly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, creased piece of paper. He handed it to her. His handwriting was rough, uneven, but the words were clear. There's no need to ask you to stay anymore. You already have. But if you'd let me, I'd like to make it proper, name and all. Tears welled in Bessie's eyes. She looked up, and Olin, quiet, broken Olin, cupped her face in his hands. His hands were calloused from building fences and burying his past, but his touch was gentle. He kissed her, not with the passion of a new lover, but with the profound relief of a man who had finally found his way home. They were married the following Sunday, right there in the yard under an old cottonwood tree. The preacher from Red Gulch came out, and the old dog, Copper, was their only witness. Bessie wore her patched blue dress, and she pinned the silver desert rose brooch to her collar. Olin had given it to her as a gift, a test, but now it felt like a promise, a symbol of a love that could bloom in the harshest of places. After the preacher left, they shared tea by the fire, just as they had 100 times before. But everything was different now. Olin had carved her new name, Bessie Merrick, into the back of the juniper bench. They had chosen this life, together. They thought the wedding was an ending, a final chapter to their pain. They were wrong. It was just the calm before the final devastating storm. Franklin Wooten had lost his legal claim. He had failed to drive them apart with whispers and threats. Now there was only one thing left for him to do. If he couldn't take the ranch, he would burn it to the ground, with them inside it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because you won't want to miss what happens next.